My name's Becca Economopoulos. A bit about my background. I've been an organizer for about 20 years, started out in the environmental movement originally as a field organizer, and also worked on many other social issues. And then moved into the online space. I ran Greenpeace USA's online department for about 5 years, and then helped to run an online social media consulting company for nonprofits and foundations. But now I'm full-time with our Arts Collective and nonprofit organization. There's a few of us in the room. We're in the early stages of developing a multi-year socially engaged art project called the Natural History Museum, which offers a framework for storytelling and action as it relates to environmentalism and climate change. So using the aesthetics, pedagogical models, and presentation forms of the American Museum of Natural History, our museum does exhibitions, field expeditions with experts and the public, educational workshops, and public programming. But we include the social and the political forces that are left out of natural history museums. We aim to model the museum of the future. So today I want to present some of our research to date and our working hypotheses. One, humans and human systems, social and political, are natural of nature. Two, the idea of a whole balanced nature is an ideological construct that fails to confront basic divisions. Three, nature is a battleground. And four, climate change is really about privatization versus an understanding of nature as something that belongs to everyone in common. So let's start with the history of environmentalism. It came onto the scene in a major way in the 1960s. Environmental problems were seen in very apocalyptic terms during that time. The ads leading up to the first Earth Day claimed it can be the beginning of the end of pollution or the beginning of the end. Apocalypse was imagined as both environmental and political. This is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio on fire, the big Santa Barbara oil spill that went on for 11 days, air pollution, toxics, pesticides. It really felt like things were breaking down. And then political apocalypse, the looming threat of annihilation from nukes against the backdrop of the Cold War. So the solutions to these twin apocalyptic threats were informed by the technocratic managerial mindset prevalent at the time. And what this means in practice is that environmentalism was conceived as a design problem with technological solutions. And this was the era, it also had pollution. This was the era of cybernetics, right? So good design that can save the world, derived from an understanding of the problem is humans had thrown nature out of balance and it needs to be brought back into balance. And the way to do this is designing through nature's patterns and principles. Here's Buckminster Fuller's beloved geodesic dome, the tetrahedron as nature's strongest shape. And this particular dome is the biosphere from the 1967 World's Fair. It functioned as a symbol of restoring balance to nature through design and representing the Earth as a unified whole, both naturally and politically. At the World's Fair, you probably know this, each country typically showcases the best of their culture and their technology. And in this case, the US did something different. They represented all the countries' best culture and technologies, putting them inside this porous, transparent globe, artifacts and cultural signifiers from the world, including its enemies, China and Russia, placing Chairman Mao poster and a hammer and sickle within the Earth. Right? In the context of the Cold War, the emphasis on a unified wholeness has an ideological component. Not only does it erase the primary global political divisions between capitalism and communism at the time, but it serves as a form for US capitalist expansion and hegemony. This is Stuart Brand. He was a friend of Bucky Fuller's. You might know him. Writer, entrepreneur, influential figure of the counterculture and the environmental movement. After the United States went to the moon, the epic event in the space race, the photos had not yet been released. And Stuart Brand launched a campaign selling these 25-cent buttons that said, "Why haven't we seen a photo of the whole Earth?" If we can just see ourselves as one, the political, environmental, and cultural ramifications would be profound. This would be the ideological game changer that would push the environmental movement forward, right? I'm speaking as brain right now. Here it is, photo-released Spaceship Earth. This image became iconic and profuse. And it became the symbol of a movement. It was the flag for the very first Earth Day in 1970, which was the biggest day of mass action and demonstrations and protests in US history. It let environmentalism register as a movement, and it let environmentalism break with the dominant mindset of conservationism. Unlike the progressive era's conservationism of the 1890s to 1920s, which was largely elitist, consisting mostly of wealthy, politically powerful men, the modern environmental movement was a social movement with more popular support. It borrowed tactics from the civil rights movement and the protests against the Vietnam War. And the right story goes that conservation and preservation was fine, but then environmentalism came along out of the post-Vietnam moment where radicalized activists traded in their little red Chairman Mao books for little green Rachel Carson Silent Spring books. I know this because I was at the Congressional Conference on Environmental Extremism and Eco-Terrorism in 2001 in Congress, at the time that I worked at Rainforest Action Network, when they mentioned Rainforest Action Network as domestic enemy number one. That was weird. So the right saw environmentalism as ideologically driven and subversive. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring book was a biologist's critique of pesticides and DDT and genetic engineering. It played a large role in articulating ecology as a subversive subject, as a perspective that cuts against the grain of materialism and the technologically engineered control of nature. The release of Silent Spring altered the balance of power in the world. It was hugely influential. No one since would be able to sell pollution as the necessary underside of progress so easily or uncritically. But there's a bifurcation of the fledgling environmental movement. The radical subject it called into being and mobilized came into conflict with the very ideology that helped to create it. The antagonistic relationship of environmentalism to its political and social context that the thousands it mobilized was protesting didn't mesh with the technology and design-driven solutions offered up as responses to ecological devastation. More specifically, the split in the movement was one, activism, right? Which was and is antagonistic. It draws a line, it picks a side. And the radical dimension of environmentalism challenged engineering, capitalism, hierarchical and systems management in keeping with the protests against the war in Vietnam, as well as other movements in the late 60s, rejecting bureaucracy, corporations, governments, and seeing them as the problem. Even as government was responding as a result of these pressure movements, right? The Nixon administration passed 4 out of her 5 core pieces of environmental legislation against this backdrop of the social movement. Okay, so the second thread of the environmental movement was the kind of engineering solutions strain. Environmental science departments mushroomed in academia overnight and embraced the mantra of ecology, but these programs were largely developed with an emphasis on the trophic dynamic systems of engineered environments. It wasn't a subversive ecology that questioned fundamental values of economics, growth, consumer habits, technological control. It represented an engineering mentality in which problems of waste, pollution, population, biodiversity, and the toxic environment were scientific problems more than political ones. And then the third strain was the kind of consumerist solutions one. So in this context of a division between radical activism and big institution system solutions, the whole earth environmentalism of Stuart Brand was, of course, on the side of radical activism, but it took the direction of consumerism. So it was his whole earth catalog, wildly popular in the US, Canada, and Australia, that targeted the back to the land counterculture, wanting to live in harmony and balance with nature, selling DIY technologies. So that was the 60s. Let's fast forward to the 90s. This is the period of neoliberal restructuring, Reagan and Thatcher, the end of the Cold War, the turn to globalization. It's the triumph of the ideology of market capitalism over that of planning. It sets up a different context for environmentalism. Individualism, which was already present in the 70s, is intensified and becomes dominant. The defeat of a labor movement leads to political reversal. Radical politics is on the side of the far right and conservative extremists. As a result, the consumerism already present in the 70s helps support and consolidate corporate control and the supposition that the market can solve all problems. Earth Day, 1990, was a big national moment, but this time it was sponsored by Monsanto and other polluting corporations. The New York Times observed, quote, "This multi-million-dollar orchestration of the event bore little resemblance to the grassroots movement driving it 20 years before." And Time magazine called the events a commercial mugging. The Reagan-era individualism can be seen in the #1 bestseller of the time, or one of the bestsellers, 50 Simple Things You Can Do to Save the Earth book. So shifting the focus and the burden of responsibility from polluting corporations to the individual. And this was also the rise of conservatism, of the wise use movement, started in the Pacific Northwest, these fake grassroots groups that were funded by industry and conservative think tanks. Conservatives recognized the power of the environmental movement, and rightly saw that movement as an attack on business as usual, an attack on the suppositions of the privatization of nature and production for the sake of private profit and the primacy of the market. The history of the environment teaches us the right recognizes nature and the environment as a battleground, while the left is going whole earth, trying to erase division and emphasize balance. The right is defining it as an ideological war. They are correct. We are of nature, and we act on nature. We are vectors in a force field of conflict, and nature is about conflict. There is no such thing as balance. So, we agree with the right, nature is a field of battle, and we're right in the middle of it. We are a force that can be exerted to push our responses to climate change in specific directions. So what then are some of the primary battle strategies employed in the current struggles? We'll start with the right's battle plan, their ultimate aim, privatization. How do they go about trying to reach it? So one is denialism, though in many ways I would argue that that's kind of a myth, right? Disinformation better describes the right strategy than denialism. The obfuscation tactics they're using are the tools of public relations. Agnotology is the study of culturally induced ignorance or doubt, particularly the publication of inaccurate or misleading scientific data. More generally, the term also highlights the increasingly common condition where more knowledge of the subject leaves one more uncertain than before. This strategy of mass confusion flourishes under what theorist Jody Dean calls communicative capitalism of the social media age. The primary mechanism emphasizes multiple options, multiple ideas, multiple alternatives. When Canadian Minister Albuquerque was asked about ice melting in the Arctic, she said there is always a debate around science and what is changing. So the second battle plan, greenwashing. A study published in 2010 by the American Marketing Association found that 95% of the consumer products claiming to be green were not green at all. TerraChoice Environmental Marketing and Advertising Consultancy issued a report showing a 79% increase in the usage of corporate greenwashing between 2007 and 2009. Take note that those are the same years that a previous speaker in the first panel showed the rise of denialism attributing the cause to the economy, which I think is a very fair attribution. But also take note that that is the period at which the right really pulled out all the guns in spending on obfuscation, anti-science, etc., and greenwashing. So kind of the third strategy, the right embraces in all of the above energy policy, it's market friendly. So the very same corporations that deny climate change simultaneously pour funding into alternative energy sources and and position themselves in a way so that when climate disasters happen, they will be able to maximize profit. Maybe that's not the worst thing. I'll talk a little bit later about why I think it is. Finally, the attack on science. It makes sense that there's a massive war on science right now. Science is presenting industry and libertarian ideologues with inconvenient truths. The conservative movement's attack on science has several prongs. Where they can attain government office, as in Canada, they use the highly effective tools of funding and defunding, regulation and deregulation to control government scientists and embolden private interests. The goal is to transfer power and resources from public services and public science to private institutions. Privatization is the aim. So if that's the right's battle plan, what's the left's? I think it can be characterized by two approaches. The truth will set you free, and the design and engineering solutions. Right. So we'll look at the truth will set you free. We've already talked about this today. As more news comes out every day about the dire impacts of climate change, such a huge, overwhelming issue with no quick fixes, denialism has actually increased. This makes sense. The Kubler-Ross model of the 5 stages of grief applies. Denial is an understandable response of climate grief. To date, the left has fought this war with an aim of ushering in the final phase there, acceptance. Once the truth of climate change is accepted by leaders and the public, solutions and action will follow, right? But acceptance can manifest as survivalism and individualistic responses. There's already a resurgence of back to the land, hunker down movement, as we saw in the 60s, the last apocalyptic moment. And we see it play out on a larger scale now. From the New York Times, prepare for the elites like never before to use climate change to transform neighborhoods, cities, even entire nations into heavily fortified islands. Already around the world, from Afghanistan to Arizona, China to Cairo, and in mushrooming megacities, much like Eco-Atlantic in Lagos, Nigeria, those able to are moving to areas where they can live better and often more greenly, with better transport and renewable technologies, green buildings, and ecological services. An average plot in Eco-Atlantic costs between $5 and $6 million. But 65% of Lagosians, or 11 million people, earn less than $2 a day. Given that Eco-Atlantic is praised by political leaders, including former President Clinton, we may see more gated cities. So the second strategy of the left, the design and engineering solutions, really championing those. So don't get me wrong, we need these technologies, but they cannot adequately address all the problems we face. In 1930, Vietnamese mathematician Kurt Gödel shakes the foundations of mathematics with his incompleteness theorems. He demonstrates that in every formal logical system there are problems that are not solvable or conclusively determinable. In any given system, something or some things are excluded. New exclusions are produced. So back to the sustainable green cities. This is Masdar City. It's a zero carbon city, or really now it's low carbon city, under construction in Abu Dhabi. From the planners and developers website, one of the most sustainable cities in the world. It's a clean tech cluster that offers a creative, entrepreneurial atmosphere where international businesses can thrive. Nikolai Ryzhkov claims in the Times that Masdar is the culmination of the gated community concept. Quote, the crystallization of another global phenomenon, the growing division of the world into refined high-end enclaves and vast formless ghettos where issues like sustainability have little immediate relevance. The project is supported by World Wildlife Federation, Sustainability Group Bioregional, the Alliance to Save Energy, and Greenpeace. The left's battle plan is a failure in that it actually supports the right's battle plan, individualism, markets, and survivalism for the 1%. What is to be done now? Climate change is not some apocalypse in the future. It is here now. We can continue to expect extreme weather events and climate disasters. Which responses do we encourage? Are we encouraging climate justice or climate competition? The Earth is not whole and unified. Instead, patterns of inequality and real political division impact the climate, and how its effects are felt and will continue to be felt as they grow over time. A recent NASA-funded study identifies the most salient interrelated factors which explain civilization collapse. Through modeling, they showed that global industrialization civilization could collapse in the coming decades due to 1, unsustainable resource exploitation beyond carrying capacities, and 2, increasingly unequal wealth distribution, the economic stratification of society into elites, rich, and masses, poor. Those 2 criteria have been in place for virtually every civilization collapse over the last 5,000 years. And the study challenges those who argue, this is NASA funded, right? Who argue that technology will resolve these challenges by increasing efficiency. Quote, technological change can raise the efficiency of resource use, but it also tends to raise both per capita resource consumption and the scale of resource extraction. So that, absent policy effects, the increases in consumption often compensate for the increased efficiency of resource use. We need to stop pointing at those who do not believe in climate change and begin pointing at those who do. The left needs to start mapping the responses to climate change, the community-driven disaster aid, the local adaptation techniques, the political advocacy efforts for mitigation legislation, and knit them together and represent those forces as a global movement under a common name. Many struggles, one front. We need to present a united front, a counterpower that can shift the political calculus and the cultural zeitgeist. One that is represented by and through many constituencies and many struggles. Inequality, public health, food security, immigration. The current fight in the US on immigration sets the stage for how we'll handle climate refugees in the next 20 to 30 years. The front that brings us together is justice. After all, nature, the environment, is common to all of us. A united front doesn't mean that our movement is monolithic, that we all have to agree, that we have the same strategies and tactics, but it means that we are a force. Collectively, we have power, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Rather than avoiding entirely the apocalyptic zeitgeist, the repressed nightmare that recurs across time and human history, we flip it and transform it in a jujitsu move so that the storm doesn't own us. We are bigger than it. We are the storm we've been waiting for. The united front. These metaphors can play out in visual imagery online, in social media, on posters and print ads, and in props and signage on the streets at events. In fact, this September here in New York City, when Ban Ki-moon is hosting, at the end of UN Week, a special one-day summit with global leaders on climate change. NGOs at the national and international level, local community-based organizations, and labor unions are all collaborating now to try to make that the biggest mobilization in climate history. Accompany this messaging with uplifting, galvanizing visuals of people en masse with an inviting color palette that has positive emotional resonance. Climate change is overwhelming and scary, but together we are turning the tide.